there's also this twisted sense of humor behind the Spectre, thinking of the Fleischer Aparo years and later iterations of the Spectre, where he would say, well, this is the form of punishment that most suits you, given your character. And of course, the Spectre's delivery of this punishment is something that has been watered down at points due to general changes in comics trends, also due to concerns from parent groups, from doctors, psychologists who have been asked to share their 2 cents worth on violence in comics. But certainly in the early days, the Spectre was one of the more brutal heroes out there, which would make it interesting seeing him in the JSA, but more on that in a couple of minutes. I'd say more than most other Golden Age characters, though, the Spectre's personality, tone, power set has really stayed the most consistent. You haven't seen a lot of changes in the Spectre over the years in terms of his or his association with the voice, the host being somebody who died unfairly and is seeking justice or redemption. The question of the nature of the character itself, all this stuff here. I just love how it was all set out right in 1940 and has carried through over the years. It's clear to see that a number of creative teams, particularly Fleischer and Aparo, Doug Munch, Ostrander and Mandrake, they've really honored what's come before with the Spectre, while at the same time looking to add new things to the character. Now, as to Spectre's relationship with Clarice Winston, I've spoken about this before, but I'll bring it up here. In the Golden Age, it really was the norm for the protagonist to have a significant other or a noteworthy love interest. Very often, it was to give the protagonist an interesting obstacle to overcome. For instance, Bruce Wayne in the beginning was engaged, and he always had to come up with explanations for his fiancée as to why his shenanigans made it so hard for him to make himself available to see her for a date. Of course, Dr. Fate, Hawkman, they would both get married, as would Jay Garrick. Alan Scott had Irene Miller in the 1940s. The Sandman had Diane Belmont. And for all these different heroes, kept their significant others either close to them or at arm's length. It's very interesting that Jim basically felt forced to keep Clarice much farther away than arm's length. And yet she kept on coming back at different points, with her final appearance being in More Fun Comics number 80. Again, this was to provide an obstacle for Jim in that he had to come up with an explanation as to why he was still going about his detective work and yet no longer had time for her. Some have suggested that Clarice was there to make the Spectre or Jim Corrigan a softer, more sympathetic character, because that's a really interesting thing about Jim Corrigan is that in the beginning of his origin, he wasn't really a very likable character, and even in subsequent stories, he still maintained that hard-boiled edge, and that made him very unique amongst the other Golden Age characters who, even in their civilian forms, like Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne, Alan Scott, Jay Garrick, were still likable guys. Well, I mean, Clark Kent came across as annoying, but it was basically because Superman was trying to cover up the fact that he was spending his days as this meek and mild-mannered reporter, but there was still a likable element to Clark Kent. With Jim Corrigan, though, at different points he comes across as rather unsympathetic, and certainly Bernard Bailey's artwork added to that impression of Jim Corrigan. He made Corrigan look, very handsome, rugged, chiseled, but there was also a hard look to Jim Corrigan. There was a very hard look in these stories, just in general. This was a perfect marriage of writing and art when it came to Siegel and Bailey. Bailey really drew to the darker tone of these stories. And actually, there's another precedent. The best Spectre stories are those stories that have that perfect combination of writing and art. Again, Fleischer and Aparo, Ostrander and Mandrake, their runs are so... they stand out so much because the art and the writing fit together perfectly. So we actually do feel sympathetic for Clarice throughout her appearances, and over time we see Jim also softening up, understanding that Clarice is not going to let him go. Something else that would soften Jim Corrigan's character was the entrance of the Spectre into the Justice Society of America. Now, the Spectre would enjoy close to a 10-year run in More Fun Comics. And while Spectre, for the most part, was a popular feature in More Fun Comics, the character was never quite popular enough to garner his own title. And so All-Star Comics was there for those heroes who were well received by the fans, but just didn't have enough to get their own solo title. So they became members of the Justice Society of America, where they would appear alongside their regular appearances in their respective anthologies. And then if they became popular enough, they stayed in the anthology book, they got their solo title, but then they would leave All-Star Comics and the JSA and become honorary reserve members of the team. So the Spectre never got that honorary reserve status. However, he was present in the JSA right from day one. And it seems interesting that an earthbound angel, or not angel, an earthbound ghost, a spirit of vengeance like the Spectre, would join this group of costumed mystery men. And so, pulling back the veil, that this was also about making the Spectre more profitable, increasing his presence within the DCU. I think there are a couple of reasons in story as to why the Spectre would join with the JSA. One reason is that Jim Corrigan's mission was pretty well a living death sentence, and that he had to eradicate the world of all evil. And in a lot of his stories, it came about that Jim was, continuing his detective work, but for the most part, his work was reactive, and that he was taking down already established evil. And so being part of the JSA might give him a chance to be more proactive and take down different forms of evil before they came into full being. I think another reason for Jim Corrigan to join the JSA was surrounding himself with other human beings would help him retain a measure of his humanity. At this point, he literally was a living ghost. He didn't have true physical form. And so one can only imagine what it felt like for Jim having these mystical powers. Later learning that he wasn't the Spectre, but he was rather the host, and that there was a Spectre force inside his very soul screaming out for vengeance. certainly being in the JSA would allow Jim to try to hold on to that which he had lost, and still have a measure of camaraderie with his fellow man. And of course, as superhero comics went into decline in the second half of the 1940s, we can say it's there that the Spectre, or Jim Corrigan rather, began losing his humanity and started to identify himself purely as the Spectre. And this is something which was addressed in later decades, especially by Mr. Ostrander and Mandrake, wherein Jim Corrigan would admit that towards the end of his time in the JSA, he really was losing his sense of humanity, and that's why he left the JSA, continued working under the guise of Jim Corrigan, but really did not prefer to associate with humans outside of his work on the Force. But certainly that softening of Jim Corrigan's character was carrying on in the pages of More Fun Comics. In issue number 73 of that title, readers were introduced in the final panel of the story to Percival Pop, the super cop, and then Pop, or Percy, as he later came to be known, will be fully introduced in More Fun Comics number 74. And first off, Percival Pop was not a cop. He was an amateur civilian sleuth who gravitated towards Jim Corrigan because he had heard that Corrigan was the finest detective on the force. And so he started by stowing away in Jim Corrigan's car trunk. And then when Corrigan found him, Pop made an appeal to Corrigan to let him follow Corrigan on the job, and later in his civilian life, just because he wanted to learn about the art of detection. And so at first Corrigan had no use for Pop, but later on he softened up to Pop, realized that there were points where Pop actually unwittingly helped Corrigan in an investigation, and so he was willing to take on Pop as kind of sort of protege. Interesting to note how Pop was depicted physically. He was drawn very cartoonish by Bailey, whereas Bailey would draw these very well detailed backgrounds and gave a lot of definition to characters like Corrigan and Clarice and others in their physical appearance. Pop came across as this really awkward looking cartoon character appearing in the real world. He had a very pronounced forehead, cheeks, a small jaw. His hair was unkempt. He wore these very unfashionable glasses. A lot of comics fans and historians actually dislike the character of Percival Pop because they see his arrival as the beginning of Corrigan's decline. But I mean, this was going on in comics in general, this softening up of the hardest of heroes, because parents were beginning to pay attention to what their kids were reading, and there were parents who were expressing their concern with what their kids were reading. Also, it's important to note that as World War II was progressing in the real world, it was becoming more and more evident that it wasn't a matter of if the Allies would win World War II, but when. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Nazis were going to fall, the Japanese were going to fall, and so there was a much greater level of enthusiasm, optimism, positivity that was carrying into the comic books. And so that's why Batman became not quite a swashbuckling, but certainly a smiling, dashing hero who appeared in the light. Hawkman's helmet was changed to a simple face mask. Dr. Fate, Kent Nelson,